Hi, my name's Michael Manning Earl, and I'm a female alcoholic. And I really want to thank Eileen for inviting me, and thank you, John. I really enjoyed your. Do you call them leads here, or do you call them shares? And every time you're in a different state, they call it something else. And boy, he convinced me he was a real alcoholic. And I always get nervous. I don't know why I get to do this a lot, and I always get nervous. My sponsor does not get nervous when she shares. She says she just gets up here and she has fun, and I can't wait till I get to that point. But I always get nervous. Thursday night I had a very humbling experience happen to me. I say it was one of those God coincidences. My last drink was on November 10th, 1979. And I was so physically sick, and I ended up in my first AA meeting, and I had to have 2 beers before that meeting. And then the next day, one of the women from that meeting took me to another meeting. And I was not to drink again since those 2 beers. And I was so physically sick the next day, which was November the 11th, that I had to leave that meeting. I couldn't sit through that meeting because I was so sick. And anyway, Thursday night, I go to a book study every week, a big book study, and the group voted to read the stories in the book. And anyway, so Thursday night, I showed up at the big book study, and we were on this story, and it's called Any Day's a Wash Day. And all of a sudden, I had a flashback to that November the 11th, the second meeting I went to when I had to go home because I was so sick. Because the woman who gave me a ride home from that meeting was a woman who wrote that story in the big book, that Any Day's a Wash Day. You know, and it was just such a chilling feeling for me to realize I was reading that story exactly 20 years to the day of meeting that woman and having her give me a ride home from the meeting. But the really chilling thing about it for me, I also remembered that she drank at 20 years of sobriety. This woman who had a story in the big book drank with 20 years of sobriety, and it really just kind of took my breath away, you know, and it really humbled me, you know, that length of time doesn't mean anything in this program if we quit doing the things that we did to get sober. We need to do the things today that we did 20 years ago, and I don't ever want to forget that. Anyway, are there any newcomers here with less than, say, 6 months of sobriety? Nobody with less than 6 months of sobriety? Oh, thank God. I thought. I was going to say I might as well leave. Anyway, I really like newcomers to know that the absolute highest to get in Alkalix Anonymous is sober. It is not a speaker. You know, and nowhere in the big book of Alkalix Anonymous does it talk about speaking, you know, standing up at a podium and speaking. It talks about one-to-one working with another drunk. And actually nowhere in the big book does it even tell you to get a sponsor. But the whole big book teaches you how to be a sponsor. In fact, there's a chapter in the big book that's on sponsorship, and it's called Working with Others. You know, and if you study the history of Alkalix Anonymous, then you'll realize why it does not tell you to get a sponsor in the first 164 pages of the big book. And that's because when they wrote that big book, we didn't even have Alkalix Anonymous. We had what we called the Drunk Squad that was in the Oxford group. And the Drunk Squad, and the Oxford group was a religious affiliation, and you know, they wanted to work with everybody, especially not with drunks, but just this group of drunks in the Oxford group only wanted to work with drunks. And they wrote this book, to go out into the world where there was no one to ask to be a sponsor. And but later on in the 12 and 12, it talks a lot about getting a sponsor and sponsorship. So I truly believe that you really need to get a sponsor. I also want to welcome those of you who are not so new but are having difficulty with this program. I saw a sign in an AA club that always gave me a lot of hope. And that sign says that you're not a failure unless you quit trying. And I believe that's true, so please, whatever you do, just keep coming back. I feel like I need to apologize up here because I don't have a Georgia accent. A lot of times people come up here and they tell me how disappointed they am I don't have a Georgia accent. But I'm really from California, and I was speaking in a conference in South Carolina, and I met the man of my dreams. This man just swept me off my feet, and we had a relationship strictly by phone and by mail, and that's a wonderful way to get to know somebody. At the International in California, he came to San Diego, and we spent a week together. Then I made 2 trips up to Georgia. My second trip up to Georgia, he was waiting for me at the airport with a bouquet of flowers, and he proposed to me. You know, it was just a fairy tale romance. It's like you read about in the fairy tale books where you're actually courted, you're proposed to, you're given an engagement ring. At our age, I was almost 50 and he was almost 60. We did have a short engagement. We got married on the beach where we met, and, you know, we had a rainbow come out and 6 dolphins out in the ocean. It was just a fairy tale romance. You know, and so I went back to California, I packed up my stuff, and I moved to Georgia. You know, and I'm a Los Angeles girl, I mean, moving to Georgia, maybe if I'd moved to Atlanta, it would have been different. But I moved to this little suburb of Augusta, right on the border of South Carolina, and it was an absolute culture shock for me. It was a culture shock. Anything I know about Bambi, anything I know about a deer is Bambi. And I love Bambi, and I moved to Georgia in October, and everybody shoots Bambi. If it moves, they shoot it, you know, and I just was so upset. The man next door to me shot a squirrel in my tree, and I just was so upset, and I looked at my husband and I said, well, at least in California, we don't shoot the animals. And he said, no, you just shoot each other. Okay, so that was a little bit of truth. But the hardest thing for me to go through at that period is I also went into menopause. And all I can say is menopause, what an order. My husband just can't go through with it. And I believe if something takes you to your knees and you have to start all over on step 1, you need to talk about it from the podium. And it shocks people. I know it shocks people. I was speaking in Cleveland, Ohio, and I said the word menopause from the podium. And you could just hear the room gasp. They just went... And this one lady, you know, when you're up here at the podium, you can see everything. If you're sleeping, I can see it. If you're scratching, I can see it. But anyway, this one lady bent over to another lady, and she said, did she say menopause? You know, I can stand up here, and I can tell you that I'm a thief, and I'm a prostitute, and you love me, and you applaud me, but for God's sake, don't say menopause. And I've also, from standing up here at the podium talking about menopause, I've seen men jab their wives and go, maybe that's what's wrong with you. But anyway, it was really a hard year for me. It's just a miracle my husband and I, you know, survived that year, because I just wanted to go back to California. I didn't know what was happening to me. You know, I developed a sleeping disorder where I didn't sleep for weeks and weeks at a time. And when I got sober, I heard no one ever died from lack of sleep. Well, that might be true, but I sure wanted to kill somebody. You know, I wanted to kill him, or I wanted to kill me. I didn't know what was happening to me. I thought I wasn't adjusting to Georgia. I thought I was having a nervous breakdown. And thank God for the kind of sponsorship that I got. You know, I had a wonderful sponsor in California who's still my sponsor, and she basically told me that having a nervous breakdown was not a good enough reason to go back to California. She reminded me that I made a commitment to marriage. And I made this commitment as a sober woman. And I wasn't 1 year sober. I wasn't 2 years sober. I was almost 16 years sober. And she told me that I had to stay. What we learned to do in Alkalix Anonymous is make commitments and keep them. You know, and so I stayed. And thank God I did that, because the last 3 years of my marriage have been just beyond my wildest dreams. Just beyond. He's a wonderful, wonderful example of Alkalix Anonymous. He's also in the program. And I just cherish him. And I just cannot wait to get on an airplane and go back home and see him. You know, I just miss him when I'm gone. You know, I just miss him. And so we've been married for 4 years now. One of my favorite lines in the big book is the bottom of 14, top of 15. I have to warn you guys, I am a big book thumper, but somebody told me I was a gentle big book thumper. So please don't walk out. You know, I am a gentle big book thumper. But one of my favorite lines is the bottom of 14, top of 15. It says, for if an alcoholic fails to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive those certain trials and low spots ahead. So that sentence tells me 2 things. First of all, it tells me if I'm not working with others, I fail to grow spiritually. I can pray, I can meditate, I can go to church, but if I'm not working with others, I fail to grow spiritually. And then that sentence also tells me if I'm not working with others, I am not going to survive those trials and low spots ahead. And at this point in my life, I was clearly in one of those trials and low spots. And I knew in Georgia that I was desperate to start working with the women in Georgia. And I was such a basket case. Women really did not want what I had. So I had to pretty much chase women down, and I'd go to this meeting, and I would, it was newcomer meeting, and I'd stick my hand out to those newcomers, and I'd give them my phone number, and I would not only give them my phone number, I would get their phone number, because it's hard for newcomers to call, and I'm the one who's desperate. I was desperate to start working with them, so I started calling the newcomers, and I finally started sponsoring, and I finally started to get better. One of the greatest gifts God sent me at that time was this beautiful woman named Vivian, and I just adore this woman, and we're so close today, maybe we're even a little too close. But Vivian had this daughter. She was 9 years old, and her name was Tina. And Tina died in a car accident as the direct result of Vivian's alcoholism. And when we got to step 8, we had to list Tina at the very top of her list of amends to make because she had never even seen her daughter's grave. And she used her daughter's death as an excuse to drink for quite a few more years. And so we went to the graveside, and we did a lot of things. We buried her chip, and we did a lot of things at the graveside. A lot of spiritual things happened that it takes too long to share about, so I'm not going to tell you everything that happened. But the one thing that did happen at the graveside, this little ladybug came, and this ladybug flew past me and flew right on to Vivian. And Vivian was absolutely mesmerized by this ladybug because ladybugs were her daughter's very favorite thing. And so today, Vivian and I always wear a ladybug, and we wear ladybugs in the memory of Tina, and we wear a ladybug in the memory of all the innocent children of alcoholic parents. So you'll notice my little ladybug. Anyway, when I crawled through the doors of Alkalix Anonymous, over 20 years ago, I had a formal 9th grade education. I didn't know how to work. I lived on welfare. I was reduced to prostitution, and I was a thief. And all of that was before I took that first drink at the age of 25. In the big book under Doctor's Opinion, it tells me that many types of alcoholics do not respond to the ordinary psychological approach. So I'm here this morning to tell you that I'm one of those alcoholics. In fact, so is my mom. We both tried to recover from this disease through the psychiatric effort. Different times, but we went to the same psychiatrist. Of course, the result was nil, but the good news is that today that very same psychiatrist is a sober member of Alkalix Anonymous. My mom and I both tried to recover from this disease through the religious effort, different times in different congregations, but the result was the same. And believe it or not, today that very same minister that counseled me is a sober member of Alkalix Anonymous. And I like to joke around and say, I think we drove these two men to drink. But the truth is, and this is the truth, my mom slept with the psychiatrist and I slept with the minister. And that is my only qualification for being the Sunday morning spiritual speaker. I'm embarrassing myself up here. But one thing I know for sure is that psychiatrist, that minister, and myself are perfect examples that AA works when other things fail. A little bit about my background. First of all, I'm Irish, German, and Cherokee, and I'm illegitimate. And being born out of wedlock today is just not a big deal. But when I was a little girl growing up, it was. And my childhood is pretty appalling. So in my mom's defense, I want to tell you a little bit about her childhood because as bad as mine was, my mom's was worse. And this program gave me the ability to have a very loving relationship with my mom, even though she couldn't quit drinking. And I lost my mom 7 years ago. She died of lung cancer. And I had the opportunity to practice love and service at home. My sister and I took my mom home. We had hospice come in, and my mom actually died with a little bit of dignity. I had the ability to get in bed with my mom, hold her all night, and just love her unconditionally. And I had to watch this woman drink on top of morphine up until the day she could no longer swallow. And it's probably one of the hardest things that I've ever done. But one thing I learned from this whole experience is that my whole life growing up, I was so focused on the things I hated about my mom, the things I didn't want to be like, that I missed all of her wonderful qualities. My mom had a lot of wonderful qualities, and I really miss her a lot today. But my mom came from an alcoholic background, and when she was 13, her mother was murdered in a drunken brawl. A drunk slit my grandmother's throat. So that left my mom out on the streets at the age of 13 trying to raise herself. At the age of 14, she had her first baby, which she gave up for adoption, and then she had me. And she did everything in her power to keep me. She later met this man, got married, had 3 boys. We all moved to California. That marriage soon ended in divorce, and my stepdad went back to Colorado. So that left my mom out in California trying to raise 4 little kids. And we were raised on welfare. We were raised in extreme, extreme poverty. Always having lights, gas, telephones turned off, always being evicted, even sleeping in cars. And then I had to deal with my mom's alcoholism. I had to deal with her prostitution, and I had to deal with her suicide attempts. When I was 12, my mom got pregnant again. And this time she sent my 3 younger brothers to live with their real dad in Colorado. Now, my 3 brothers were my very best friends. When you're sleeping in cars and you're always being evicted, you don't have an opportunity to make friends. So my brothers were my friends. So I feel like at the age of 12, I already had all these feelings that I later brought with me to Alkalix Anonymous. And those feelings were of low self-worth, low self-esteem, not equal to, and just not good enough. And that was a direct result of all that poverty. That drunken psychiatrist pointed out to me that I had these issues of abandonment. You know, I never knew my real dad. My stepdad went away. My 3 brothers went away. My mom's always trying to kill herself. And because of some other childhood experiences, I would say I am a fear-based person. I have always been afraid of people, places, and things. And the 2 very important things I learned when I got to the program of Alkalix Anonymous is, first of all, I learned that feelings are not facts. And all those things I used to think about myself were not the truth. And best of all, I learned how to walk through fear. And I learned that every time I walk through fear, I'm actually exercising faith. And this last 7 or 8 years, I lose track of time, 8 years or so, I've walked through one of my biggest fears, and it's getting on airplanes. This trip was a hard one after that last crash. And I found out that I'm not even afraid of flying. I'm afraid of crashing. My sponsor told me I'd better be clear on what my fear was when I was asking God to remove it. But I hear a lot of the things in the rooms of Alkalix Anonymous that are not necessarily in the big book. And the one thing I used to always hear is that you could not have fear and faith at the same time. If you had fear, you didn't have any faith. And I just couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong in my program because I still had all this fear. And I had worked these steps as hard as I could work these steps. And I have had spiritual experiences, but I still had all this fear. And I'd go up to some of these people who'd make that statement, and somebody would say, well, it sounds to me like you haven't taken a thorough 3rd step. Well, today I know the 3rd step is only a decision. That's all the 3rd step is. You know, and to follow up on that decision is I have to take those actions of 4 through 9. But finally, I went up to one of these old-timers in the Long Beach area, and I was kind of crying on his shoulder about having all this fear and what was wrong with my program. And he took me to the big book of Alkalix Anonymous. And he pointed out a sentence to me on page 68, which is under the fear inventory. And first of all, he said, Michael, nowhere in the first 164 pages of this book does it say you cannot have fear and faith at the same time. And then he pointed out that sentence, and that sentence says, all men of faith have courage. All men of faith have courage. And then he pointed out to me that you don't need courage unless you're afraid. And then he took me to the end of that paragraph where it gives you that little fear prayer to use when you're in fear. And I use it a lot today. God, remove my fear and direct my attention to what you'd have me be. And I'm always directed to work with another person, whether they're in the program or out of the program. If I can get out of me and I can think about you, then God can get in there and fix me. I was on the airplane. We were having a lot of problems just getting out of Augusta yesterday. I couldn't hardly get to my flight to get here. And the little lady sitting next to me was just terrified of flying. Well, I'm terrified of flying, but I was acting as if, and I just took her hand and I said, I've been flying every weekend for this is going to be fine, just fine. All I did was act as if. But I got to get out of myself, and I got to help her, and that helped me on the rest of this trip. Anyway, that last little sentence after that fear prayer, it says, at once we commenced to outgrow fear. It does not say at once we outgrow fear. It says we commenced to outgrow fear. So I'm here today to tell you that I'm still commencing. In steps 10 and 11 in the Big Book, in step 10 it tells me, to continue watching for fear. And it says this is not an overnight matter, that this should continue for a lifetime. Wow, that was a relief for me, because 20 years I still have fear. And then in step 11 it says, on retiring at night, when I look at my day, it says, were you afraid? Then it says, do I need to share that with somebody? And then at the bottom of that it says, I ask God's forgiveness. On the bottom of that paragraph it says, I ask God's forgiveness. And then I ask God what corrective measures need to be taken. I was in a meeting about 10 years ago, and I was starting to have panic attacks really bad at 10 years of sobriety. And I would have a panic attack every time I drove very far from my house. So my solution was I didn't go anywhere. And I would drive from my house to a meeting to home, and that was it, just this little triangle. That's all I could do. And I was sitting in a meeting, and there was this woman there who I had never seen before. And she said that she was so excited to be in a meeting of Alkalix Anonymous because she hadn't left her house in 2 years. She said she had something called agoraphobia. Now, I never even heard the word agoraphobia, but she described her symptoms, and her symptoms were exactly what was happening to me. And I knew that if I didn't take some actions, that I was eventually going to end up housebound like she did. So I went home and I listed these panic attacks and this fear on my step 6. I called my sponsor, and we said the 7th step prayer, praying to God to have this removed. And then my sponsor gave me some corrective measures to take. She had me get on the freeway the very next day and get off on the first exit. The second day she had me get on the freeway and get off on the second exit. The third day she had me get on the freeway and get off on the third exit. And I finally started to commence to outgrow that fear. And I spent 2 years, from 10 years of sobriety to 12 years of sobriety, just in stark terror all the time. Because once you say those prayers and you're really asking God to help you walk through this stuff, things start to happen. I just kind of got catapulted into speaking. I'd never even stood up at a podium and shared anything of my story for 11 years. I was terrified of people. I was terrified of talking to you. I was terrified of telling you about me. And that's what happened to me. Once I said that prayer and my sponsor started working with me, I ended up having to go in her place when she was very sick to a meeting and share my story. And it was terrifying for me. And then from that meeting I got invited to 3 more meetings. And then I had to go drive out of the city, and it was like I was in terror constantly. And then I got invited to speak at my first convention where I had to get on an airplane. So it was just terror for 2 years. Terror, terror, terror. But I am so glad I had the willingness to walk through all that fear. Even though I'm still afraid when I get on an airplane, it's nothing like it was. It's not the kind of fear where I hyperventilate and my legs go out from underneath me. If it wasn't for this willingness to walk through this fear, I wouldn't have met the man of my dreams, the husband, and made that move from the West Coast to the East Coast. I absolutely love the East Coast. I love Georgia. I would never go back. And all of this has happened to me because I have the willingness to walk through fear. And every time I walk through fear, I exercise faith. And it's not as fast as I would like it, but I can definitely see that it's progress, not perfection. Anyway, so when I was 13 years, my mom did have this baby. And I had to learn how to be a mom, and I didn't even know how to be a kid. But my mom's alcoholism took her out of the home. She was never, ever around, and I had full responsibility of this little baby. And this little baby is sleeping in a dresser drawer. I eventually had to potty train her, bottle break her. I'm failing in school because I can't get to school because of this responsibility. Now, after doing my inventory, I found out the truth was I hated school anyway. When I went to school, I was either an object of pity around my peers, or I was teased about the way I dressed and teased about my hair. And so specifically to get out of my home life, at the age of 15, I got married. And the man I married was 18. He lived in the neighborhood. He came from a similar background. And I have such a colorful past that I like to brag about this. I want everyone here to know when I got married at the age of 15, I was not pregnant. At the age of 15... At the age of 15, I had high morals and high values. I really did. I had these 2 TV shows I used to watch. They were my favorite programs. Most of you are too young to remember these shows, but it was Donna Reed and Father Knows Best. And these were family programs, and because of these programs, I had these high morals and high values. My whole life growing up, all I knew is when I grew up, I did not want to be an alcoholic like my mom, and I didn't want to prostitute like my mom. So when I got married at the age of 15, I had this wild idea that I was Miss Donna Reed marrying Mr. Father Knows Best, and unfortunately it didn't turn out that way, and I believe the man I married was an alcoholic. One indication, his name was Johnny Walker. I didn't have a clue back then. But I want to share a story with you about that sister of mine, the one that slept in the dresser drawer. Because when I got to the program of Alkalix Anonymous, I used to blame my alcoholism on my mom's alcoholism. And I blamed the way I turned out on the way I was raised. And after I got sober in this program, I took a good look at that sister of mine because she came from the very same background. In fact, I would say her childhood was worse than mine because my mom's disease had progressed. And my sister was literally forced to move out of the house at the age of 16. So she quit school and she moved out. But what she did is she took that high school equivalency test. And she had to take it 3 times until she finally passed it. With this test under her belt, under a special youth program, she went to work for the city of Long Beach. At the age of 26, she retired from the city of Long Beach. She took her 10 years retirement pay. She bought her own business. She later married the head traffic engineer for the city of Long Beach. And 7 years ago, at the age of 30, my sister was awarded Woman Entrepreneur of the Year. Now, even today, sometimes I still don't get it. Same mom, same background, but different reactions. And the difference is my sister is not an alcoholic. My sister is not bodily and mentally different from her fellows. My sister reacts to life situations differently than I do. So today I get to accept responsibility, and I can no longer blame those people, places, and things. I am an alcoholic, and I do have a disease, but today I have a solution. And for me, part of my solution is being accountable for my actions, my past actions and my present actions. So anyway, at the age of 15, I got married. At the age of 17, I did have a baby. At the age of 18, I had to get out of this marriage because this man took me through a whole new phase of alcoholism I never experienced with my mom, and it's called physical abuse. And he never abused me unless he was drinking, but he abused me to the point of cutting me up with a knife, and I had to have surgery to repair the damage. So I got out of that marriage at the age of 18, and I feel like that's when I started on the road of being everything I swore I'd never be, doing everything I swore I'd never do. I hadn't even taken a drink of alcohol yet. I always intuitively knew if I took a drink, I'd be an alcoholic. But it started out with me being a single mother living on welfare. My whole life growing up like that, I swore when I grew up I was not going to live like that, and there I was. Now, on page 23 in the big book, it says the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than his body. So we're talking about the main problem being the mental obsession and not the physical allergy. So I know for me, I practiced my disease of alcoholism way before I ever took that first drink because I've always had the mental obsession part of this disease. And I practiced it in the form of compulsive overeating. I would shove food in my mouth instead of alcohol. And then I discovered that wonderful world of diet pills. And that's back in the days when doctors gave really, really good amphetamines. Methadone, dexedrine, it's illegal now. So I went on a diet for 16 years. When I finally took that drink of alcohol at the age of 25, I immediately had the physical allergy. From that very first drink, I had the phenomenon of craving. From that very first drink, I had a personality change, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You read about that in the big book. The big book refers to that as a real alcoholic. And I personally am so physically allergic to alcohol. When I consume alcohol, I break out in a rash, welts, and hives all over my body. And I was always too drunk to have a clue that that wasn't normal. And if I'd had a clue, it wouldn't have made a difference. But from that very first drink, I drank morning, noon, and night, and I did not draw a sober breath from the age of 25 to the age of 31. And that is not an exaggeration. I had this huge spiritual experience way before I ever got to this program. And this was equivalent to the one that Bill had in Bill's story. Now, in the big book, it says, as a result of a spiritual awakening, you'll have a change in psyche, a change in attitude. It says you'll have this huge emotional displacement and rearrangement. And this spiritual experience I had was not enough for me to achieve that. And I believe it's because I did not have a plan of action to go with it. But it was enough for me to come to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. So what I did with this experience is I went to this church, I counseled with this minister, and I told him all about my spiritual experience, and I shared with him all my character defects, all my shortcomings. And this man assured me if I got really active in this church, and I read all these inspirational books, and I did all this positive thinking and all these affirmations, that I could be everything that I ever wanted to be. After I got to this program, I heard a speaker at the podium say, if you're alcoholic, you cannot think your way into right actions. He said, if you're alcoholic, you have to act your way into right thinking. And I am absolute proof of that, because I got really active in that church. I even became the secretary of that church, and I struggled reading those books because I could barely read. I did all that positive thinking, constant affirmations, and the only thing that resulted is I ended up having a torrid affair with this minister, and it absolutely infuriated his wife. And and the rest of the congregation wasn't too excited about it either. Well, they were excited, but it wasn't the right kind of excited. But the one thing I'm going to share with you is the one thing I thought I'd take to the grave with me as secretary of that church. It was my job to handle that money. And when I handled that money, I stole part of that money. You know, and I just had this spiritual experience, and I turned to God for help, and I ended up seducing his minister and ripping off his church. So I truly know the feeling of hopelessness that they share about in the big book. And I'm going to share two stories with you while I'm on the subject of the minister. Excuse me. Sometimes when I fly, I get this. I'm going to share two stories with you while I'm on the subject of the minister. And I'd like to share this first story because it's the first time I was ever able to laugh at any part of my alcoholism. When I got to this program, I heard that laughter was healing. But I always thought my story was just much too serious. And when I got here, I used to hide out at the very back of the room. And I have a friend named Teddy. And Teddy calls the back of the room the half measure section or the denial section. Now, I didn't hang out back there for either of those reasons. I hung out back there because I couldn't read very well. And I was terrified that they would ask me to read something. And I literally could not say the word anonymity for over 6 months. So I'd always hide out at the back of the room. And speakers in California, they're very dramatic in California. They'd get up here and they'd share their story, and people would laugh. You know, they're very funny, and people would laugh. And at first, I was absolutely incapable of laughing. But one day, after I had some sobriety under my belt, I caught myself in the back of the room laughing too. And right after I had this huge belly laugh, I found myself thinking, well, that might be funny for you. But there is nothing, absolutely nothing in my background I could ever laugh at. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I was speaking in Seal Beach, and it was just, I guess it was 8 years ago, and it was just my second time to ever give an AA talk. I never shared my story till I was 11 years sober. And my daughter wanted to come hear me. Now, my daughter got to this program for the first time when she was 15 years old, and at the age of 18, because of a tragedy, she lost her sobriety. But and so she was in and out. She lost her faith in God. She was in and out, in and out, in and out. And this was a point in time where she's desperately trying to get sober again. And she heard I was talking, so she really wanted to come hear me. And before the meeting, she brought today I want to tell you my daughter's 34 years old, and she has 7 years of big book sobriety, and I'm very, very proud of her. But anyway, so before the meeting, she brought some of her program girlfriends over to my house. We sat down and we had coffee. And then my daughter proceeded to tell her girlfriends my drunkalogue. And it was just the first time I was ever able to laugh at anything. For some reason, it was a little funnier coming out of her mouth than out of my head. And of course, she was telling these girls all about the minister. And I just never I just never thought how some of this stuff looks through the eyes of a little 9-year-old, because she was 9 years old when I was seeing this minister. So she's telling these girls that I'm dragging her off to church every day, and she's learning things like the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule. I'm constantly preaching all this religious stuff to her. She comes home from school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She opens the bedroom door, and there, naked in bed with her mom, was the married minister of the church. Now, that's not the funny part. And when she said that, I just felt all this shame, all this guilt, and all this embarrassment. And I just looked at my daughter in the most sympathetic way. I said, God, honey, that had to be a terrible shock. And my daughter just looked at me and she said, no, Mom, I don't know what shocked me the most, seeing that minister naked or seeing his artificial leg on the floor. Up until that time, I totally forgot he had an artificial leg. And this was a huge leg. I don't know how I forgot it. But trust me, this man in no way was disabled. Okay, hot flash. Oh. I had something really funny happen to me. I never share this. You're one of the few groups that are going to get to hear this. I was speaking in Maine, and I'd shared this. It was a big, huge group, and you know how they line up to thank the speaker. I had this huge line thanking me, and all of a sudden this man yelled, Michael, and I looked over at him, and he threw his artificial leg at me. I was so shocked. I didn't know what to do, so I just looked at him, and I went, oh, baby. Oh, God, you never know what's going to happen at these conferences. Anyway, after I got to the program of Alkalix Anonymous and I started working those 12 steps, I found for me the most important step was step 9. Now, step 9 is the amends step, the step where we make restitution. And I recommend you do the first 8 steps before you get to step 9. I know some people come into this program, they take a look at step 9, it's so scary, they turn around and they leave. Other people come in and start right in on step 9 and make inappropriate amends. I believe the steps are in order for a reason, and I believe this one in particular should be taken with the advice of a sponsor. But I call step 9 the freedom step. This is the step that truly freed me from the bondage of my past. And it's just not a coincidence that in the big book those promises come after step 9. It says before you're halfway through, you're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. It says you won't regret the past or wish to shut the door on it, and so on and so on. And I did not have to wait to get halfway through step 9. That happened to me with my very first amends, and that was going back to that church and telling that minister I used to steal from the church funds, and he told me he knew that. And I set up a payment schedule to pay back the church. Then I had to tell him that I used to steal out of his wallet when he was in the shower. He told me he did not know that. So I made restitution to him. But the neat thing about this experience is he shared with me at that time, he knew exactly what I was doing. By the time I got to him, he had 2 years of sobriety in the program of Alkalix Anonymous. When he lost his leg in that motorcycle accident, he was an alcoholic and a drug addict, and he actually died on the operating table. He had one of those near-death experiences, which for him was his spiritual experience. And that's what led him into ministerial school and becoming a minister. And even he could not get sober in church. And I'm not putting down churches, and I'm not putting down the psychiatric effort. Because the big book of Alkalix Anonymous makes it real clear that this program owes a lot to both of these institutions. And in the big book it says, if you need professional help, do not hesitate to seek it. But I got to tell you, for me, it was all about that miracle that happens when one drunk reaches out to another drunk. So I've been kicked out of this church. I'm 27 years old. I'm full on into my drinking. I'm living in an apartment I'm being evicted from. But this is my normal M.O. I'm always being evicted. Lights and gas had been turned off for a long time, but I still had a telephone because it was one of my working priorities. And I got this call at 11 o'clock at night, and I could not believe the man on the other end of this phone. It was my real dad. Now, I barely knew this man's name was on my birth certificate, and he wanted to make amends for not being in my life. He wanted to get to know me, and he wanted to get to know my daughter, so he offered me an opportunity to move to Colorado to get to know his whole family. And I did not want to go. I didn't have any desire to get to know him, but mostly I didn't want to move to the snow. But at that point in my life, I didn't have anywhere to go except for out on the streets. And deep down inside, I had this little hope, if I did this geographic, maybe I could change. So I made that move to Colorado, and I lived there for 3 months. And in that 3-month period, this man and his family could not wait to kick me out of the state of Colorado. In that 3-month period, I ended up having affairs with the bus drivers on the way over there, getting pregnant, having an abortion, falling down the stairs and breaking my leg, ripping off his medicine cabinet, ripping off his booze cabinet, and ripping off his money. So they literally kicked me out of the state of Colorado. I'm going to tell you how I broke that leg. Obviously, I was drunk. And in the neighborhood where I lived, the stores closed at 12. I didn't have a car. I had to walk everywhere. And the store closed at 12, so I had to make my final liquor run before the store closed. And I lived in a second-floor apartment. It's snowing outside. The stairs are very icy. I'm walking down the stairs. I'm hanging onto the railing with my right hand. And my daughter's on the left side of me trying to hold me up. And all of a sudden, I looked up at another second-floor apartment because the door just opened. And out of that door walked a priest. I don't know what he was doing there, but he had the collar, the robe, everything. He was definitely a man of God. And I am very angry at God. I'm angry at God because I just seduced his minister and ripped off his church. So now I'm mad at God. And I looked up at that priest and I let go of the railing with my right hand. I flipped up my middle finger and I said, F you, God. And I immediately fell down the stairs and broke my leg. Now, my daughter told me that was the day she started believing in a punishing God. And today we both know I fell strictly because I was drunk. But anyway, my real dad was second on my list of amends to make when I started making my amends. And I wrote this man a letter. And I told him I was sober in the program of Alkalix Anonymous and I wanted to make restitution for my behavior up there. And I sent him a check trying to set up a payment schedule to pay him back. And basically what he and the family did is they sent me the check back with a little note that said they didn't want my money and they never wanted to hear from me again. I was working with a sponsor, so of course I stayed sober, but I really did want to make these amends. So on every Father's Day and on every birthday, I would send him an appropriate card. And I would tell him that I was still sober in the program of Alkalix Anonymous and I still wanted to make restitution for my behavior. And he would never acknowledge me. I did this for years and years, and he would never acknowledge me. And finally, in 1985 or 1986, I got a reply back. And I cannot tell you how excited I was when I saw the return address on that envelope. I ripped open the envelope, and the only thing that was in it was a picture of his tombstone and the obituary of the newspaper. He had just died. And that was the family's way of telling me not to bother trying anymore. And there are no words to express the kind of pain I felt. You would have thought I knew him my whole life, and I didn't. But I took it real, real hard. And the people in Alkalix Anonymous pointed out to me I don't make amends for approval. The big book tells me I don't make amends to be forgiven. I make amends to clean up my side of the street. I make amends to stay sober. So all I can tell you is that those actions I took worked. Because not once, not even once, was I ever tempted to drink over that rejection. I'm just so sorry he didn't get to know the person I am today, because I know he would have been proud. So anyway, I've been kicked out of this church, and now I'm kicked out of a state. I'm living back in Long Beach, California, across the street from Franklin Junior High. Franklin Junior High is a gang-related school. My daughter's now 14 years old, and she's running with a very dangerous gang. And I'm doing awful, humiliating, embarrassing things to my daughter. But I'm not only embarrassing my daughter, I was embarrassing this entire gang. I was living I was living in another apartment I was being evicted from. Lights, gas, and telephone had all been turned off for months and months. And I'm hiding out from the landlord because he wanted to serve me papers, so I always kept my drapes closed. So my apartment is always dark. Day and night, my apartment's dark. But my apartment is so dark now that I'm seeing evil spirits. And unless you've seen them, they're hard to describe. But these evil spirits would do things to me like follow me around the house. And then I, in turn, would do things like crawl out of the house on my hands and knees, butt naked, across the street to the school ground and warn my daughter and her gang friends not to come home because the house was possessed with evil spirits. And this is the kind of stuff I did that makes me wish to God I was a blackout drinker. But I'm not a blackout drinker. I get to remember it all. All the neighbors really felt sorry for my daughter. They'd hide her out. They'd feed her. One day we were both next door at the neighbor's house, and on her counter she had a bottle of 100 proof vodka. Something happened outside. My neighbor and my daughter stepped outside, and I lagged behind because I wanted to drink some of that vodka down real fast. So I just grabbed the bottle, and I started drinking right out of the bottle, which was not unusual. That was normal for me. And I don't know how much I drank or how fast I drank it, but I do know it was enough to stop my respiratory system. At that point, I stopped breathing. And I can remember the sensation I couldn't breathe, and that's the last thing I remember. I don't remember the paramedics. I don't remember being rushed to the hospital. I don't remember being brought back to life. By the time I had any memory, I woke up with both my arms strapped down to a hospital bed. A nurse was slapping me in the face because I was screaming obscenities at her because I was a very mean and vile drunk. But this experience did get my attention. This time I had almost died under the influence of alcohol, and it scared me. I did not want to die out there. This is my only experience smoking pot, but I was trying really hard not to drink that day, and I don't have any friends of my own, so I smoked this pot with my daughter and her friends. And afterwards, we're walking down the street, and I have on these tight jeans, and I have both my hands stuck down in my pockets. And I don't know if I tripped over a crack or tripped over my own foot, but I tripped and I just started to go down. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been on pot, but for me, it was different. First of all, I had the feeling that I was in slow motion. I had the sensation that the cement was coming up at my face, and no matter what I did, and I tried really hard, I could not get my hands out of my pockets. So you have to picture a grown woman laying with her face smashed in cement, and both of her hands are still sticking out of her pockets. And all the kids standing around me were laughing hysterically. They were absolutely hysterical. I guess you laugh when you're on pot. I know I wasn't laughing. But I could hear them laughing, and as I heard that laughter, I had that moment of clarity. I knew right then and there, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that pot was not the answer. And I went right back to my drinking, and I drank at the same pace for a while longer. And I used to stand up here and say, I don't know what finally happened. I just reached the point of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. But today I can tell you I do know what happened. I finally reached a point you read about on page 151 in the Big Book of Alkalix Anonymous, and it talks about facing those hideous 4 horsemen. I woke up on my front room floor, and I felt those feelings of terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. I was laying in a puddle of fluid. I don't know what the fluid was. I took the first 3 steps, and I didn't even know what the first 3 steps were. But I knew that I was powerless over alcohol and that my life had never, ever been manageable. I already believed that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. I just didn't know if he would because of what I'd done to the church. And this was my way of turning my will and my life over to the care of God as I just got on my knees. And I said, God, please, I don't care how you do it, but please just get me sober. And I managed to get to a telephone. I called a prayer line that was affiliated with the church I was in, and I asked them to pray for me because in my mind I thought if God wouldn't listen to my prayers because of what I'd done to the church, maybe God would listen to their prayers. And they prayed for me for 30 days, and within 30 days I was sober. And it's a series of God coincidences that landed me in my first meeting of Alkalix Anonymous because I would never have come to AA. I hated Alkalix Anonymous. My mom was in and out of AA for years, and it didn't work for her. Today, I know my mom did not work the program of Alkalix Anonymous. But the real reason I didn't want to come here is because I never saw my mom with an AA woman. I only saw my mom with AA men, and they're not the men that I've connected with. some people come into these rooms and they just take up space. They don't care about the 12 traditions. They don't care about the 12 steps. They just take up space. And those are the kind of people my mom hung out with. And anyway, I was a very young girl at the time, 12 or 13, and 14 or 15. I don't know how old I was, but a couple of these so-called AA men made serious passes at me. So that's what I thought about the men in Alkalix Anonymous. And I think our actions out there are very important because we might be the only copy of a big book someone comes in contact with. But anyway, it was a series of God coincidences that landed me in that first meeting. And as I said earlier, I was so physically sick from withdrawals, there's no way I would have made that meeting without a drink. And I ended up having 2 beers before that meeting. That's the last drink I ever had, and that was on November 10th, 1979. However, I don't celebrate my birthday till January 23rd, 1980, because that's when I gave up those diet pills. But, for 10 years, when I quit drinking, I immediately started working my steps. I quit drinking, I started working my steps, and God revealed to me right away I was not sober if I was abusing those pills. But I still always celebrated my birthday for the first 10 years in November because of that 10th tradition. AA has no opinion on outside issues. So anyway, at 10 years of sobriety, I got a new group and a new sponsor, and I guess they didn't know about that tradition because they didn't care. They changed my sobriety date by almost 3 months. So I celebrate January 23rd, 1980. But anyway, I went into that first meeting, and the old-timers there are the ones that just latched on to me. They just gave me a coffee commitment in my first 2 weeks, and they were taking me, and I did not have enough sobriety. And these were men. I had a female sponsor, but these were men, and they were the father images that I never had. And they were taking me to hospitals and sanatoriums and detoxes and prisons. I did not have enough sobriety, but I think they knew they'd lose me if they didn't get me active right away. And there was no worry about the 13th step. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what the 13th step is? Gosh, a lot of experience in New York, huh? No worry about the 13th step. You should have seen me. I was not what you'd call 13th steppable. I was huge. I was very, very obese. I had all this wild bleach blonde hair. I don't know if you've ever been drunk and tried to bleach your hair, but you do this thing called overlapping, and you cause your hair to break off. And then I'd forget I had bleach on my hair at other times, so I had a few bald spots with some scabby sores. And then the last 2 months, I didn't bleach it at all. So I had big black roots, a few bald spots with sores because I kept scratching them, and different lengths of broken off bleach blonde hair. My front teeth were worn up to here, so it looked like I had no front teeth. I was always profusely sweating. I was an alcoholic woman that did not bathe, and I wore this big purple serape to cover my body because I thought you wouldn't see me. So it's hard to believe. It's still hard for me to believe. So there is absolutely no worry about the 13th step. These guys just wanted to clean me up and get me sober. But anyway, we had this one old-timer, and if you mentioned the drugs, he would jump up, cuss you out, tell you to go to NA, and then he'd split. So I learned early on in my sobriety not to, to keep my mouth shut about those diet pills. But that allowed me to take diet pills for 3 more months. But thank God the steps revealed to me that I had to get real honest in that area. Anyway, so I go into my meeting of Alkalix Anonymous. I have 2 beers in my system. So now I have a little bit of a personality change going on. Okay, I admit I'm an alcoholic, but I'm not an alcoholic like you guys. You guys are alcoholics like my mom. It's the disease of perception. And I was buying it. And the first person shared that he'd been a blackout drinker. And I looked at my 14-year-old daughter who desperately wanted me to get sober, and I said, I have never had a blackout. The next person shared that he'd been to jail. I looked at my daughter and I said, I have never been to jail. The truth is, I was a home drinker. I was always too drunk to get out of my house to get arrested. And when I managed to crawl out on my hands and knees, a gang member would capture me and put me to bed. But the third person shared that he had 5 502s. Now, back in California, a 502 was a drunk driving. I had my arms crossed like this, and I was so defiant, and word for word, I said to my daughter, I said, that does it. I have never, ever had a drunk driving. And this time my daughter looked at me with all the hate, all the contempt a pre-Al-Anon could have in her eyes, and word for word she said, Mom, you don't even have a car. But when she said that, something clicked for me. I knew I was just sitting there looking for the differences. So if any of you are new or nearly new, I hope you're not trying to judge your alcoholism by my actions or John's actions, for God's sakes. And I know we have stories that might be hard to identify with, but maybe you can identify with the feelings. Maybe you've had those feelings of low self-worth, low self-esteem, not equal to and just not good enough. Maybe you've had those feelings of overwhelming fear. And this is the kind of fear that paralyzes you. It keeps you from going back to school. It keeps you from getting a better job. It did that for me, but it also kept me from getting on elevators, couldn't drive over bridges, couldn't get on airplanes, couldn't drive on freeways. It made my world real, real small. As I said, I used to have severe panic attacks behind my fear and sobriety. Or maybe you're like the alcoholic they talk about in the big book, grandiose and bitter than. To me, it's all the same for an alcoholic. It's just that my ego was in reverse. There's nothing as self-centered as self-centered fear and low self-esteem. The next person who shared was my point of identification. And I believe if she hadn't been in that meeting that night, I might not be standing here tonight because of my attitude, this morning because of my attitude. But she said that she did not drink till later on in life. She said she practiced her disease of alcoholism way before she ever took that first drink, and she did it in the form of compulsive overeating and amphetamine abuse. And that's when that old-timer jumped up, cussed her out, and took off. But the one thing she said, and this is the real reason why I stayed, she said her whole life growing up, some kids wanted to be doctors. Some kids wanted to be lawyers. And all she ever wanted to do when she grew up was just not to be an alcoholic like her mom. And when she said that, I started to cry, and I couldn't stop. And I cried throughout the rest of the meeting because that's absolutely the first time in my life I ever felt like I belonged. And I'm supposed to share with you what it was like, what happened to change me, and what I'm like today. And what happened to change me were the 12 steps of Alkalix Anonymous. And I used to talk about each step individually, but as you add menopause and that kind of stuff, your story gets a little bit long. So I just will let you know I did it all according to the big book of Alkalix Anonymous and spent a lot of time, even today, on step 6 and 7. But my sponsor really did stress the 12th step for me. She broke it into 3 parts. That first part, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of doing those first 11 steps. She said did not necessarily mean a belief in God. She said a lot of us believe in God when we get here. Some people come in here and they have to make the 12 steps their higher power, or they have to make the group their higher power. She said when you've had that spiritual awakening is where you've actually had that huge emotional displacement and rearrangement. You've had that change in psyche. You've had that change in attitude. Something about you is just different. You've had a transformation, and it comes from deep within. And when it comes to carrying the message, if I have 15 days of sobriety, I give my phone number to someone who has 7. And she said length of sobriety was not the qualification for sponsorship in this program. The qualification for sponsorship in this program is that you have done your steps. Because the real job of a sponsor is to guide you through the steps of the program. Applying these principles in all my affairs, she said that meant I had to practice love and service at work. I had to practice love and service at home. I can't come into this program, walk that walk, talk that talk, and then go out in the world and act like a jerk. And my sponsor knew a lot about Bill W., and she told me right from the start that Bill did not like to use the same word twice. That character defects and shortcomings were the same thing. They're both the exact nature of your wrongs in step 5 that we get from step 4. And that principles and steps are the same thing, at least according to the big book. So if I'm applying these principles in all my affairs, I'm applying these steps in all my affairs. And she said if I was willing to grow along spiritual lines, and I stayed current in my steps, eventually someday God would reveal to me when it's time to give up other destructive behavior. The big book says we have to get rid of all those old ideas. She said it was not okay for me to just not drink, but to go ahead and steal. It's not okay for me to just not drink, but to go ahead and prostitute. It's not okay for me to just not drink, but to abuse my daughter. And it's not okay for me to just not drink, but to binge my brains out and take diet pills. She said if I was working the last part of the 12th step in Alkalix Anonymous, those things were not okay. But thank God she told me I didn't have to do it all at one time, or I surely would have failed. All those things I just mentioned were listed on my Step 6, my character defects, and I don't practice any of them today. Today I have new character defects. Today I'm judgmental and opinionated. And I really work with my higher power on that because I pay a heavy price when I get into judgment. This is what happens to me. When I judge you, I end up walking in your shoes, experiencing your experience to get over the judgment. And that is a heavy price to pay. So I really consciously work with my higher power on that today because I'm just not willing to pay that price. Anyway, so I'm 6 months sober. I'm on my 9th step. My sponsor told me I had to get a job. I had to be fully self-supporting through my own contributions, and I don't know how to work. I went out there and I got that first job, and that's where I learned how to work. I learned things like how to get there every day, how to get there on time, how to not leave early, how to only take a 30-minute lunch break. I did not know how to do those things, and I learned them here in Alkalix Anonymous. I worked my first job full-time for 8 years. I stayed on another 2 years part-time after I took another full-time position. So I was there for a total of 10 years. And in that first 8-year period, I went back to high school. And I was not smart enough to pass a GED. I had to go back to high school. And I graduated from high school in 1985, and I was 36 years old. And I graduated with a cap and gown, a real ceremony, and 450 18-year-olds. These kids were real bad, and they were kicked out of day school, so they went to night school, but I just fit right in with them. What I did for the next 6 years is I went to work for a musical theater industry or corporation, and I was not qualified for that position, but they were willing to take a chance on me. So I had to be willing to take a chance on them because it was scary for me to leave my other job. My self-esteem was there. And this was an equity corporation, and equity means union, which means that they dealt with big major stars. And I started out in the very bottom in the accounting department, and I went back to school. And within a period of time, I worked myself up to business manager of this multi-million-dollar corporation. And as business manager, I dealt with millions of dollars. And this is the honest to God truth. When I got to this program, I didn't even know how many zeros were in $1 million. I have participated in union negotiations, and I have been invited into some of the homes of some of the most famous people you see on stage, screen, and TV. And even today, I'll see myself in a picture with a very famous person, and I just get overwhelmed. And I just think, how did I ever get from the gutters of Long Beach to being invited into some of these places? And how that happened is I worked the last part of that 12th step, and I applied these principles in all my affairs. I'm going to share 2 stories with you, and then I'm going to close. And the first story is 10 years was a very active year for me dealing with stuff, and I almost took a drink at 10 years of sobriety. And aside from the panic attacks, everything in my life was absolutely perfect. It was absolutely perfect. And I was business manager of this multi-million-dollar corporation, and I was going to a birthday party for Debbie Reynolds. Nowadays, everyone's so young they don't have a clue who Debbie Reynolds is, and so they're not the least bit impressed. But I was very impressed. You know, when I was a little girl, Debbie Reynolds was my very favorite movie star, and this was her 57th birthday that I was invited to go to. And you know, and at that, everything in my life was so perfect that I almost took a drink. You know, I almost took a drink. The Big Book says you'll be placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected, if you're in fit spiritual condition. I was not in fit spiritual condition. In the first place, I hadn't been to a meeting of Alkalix Anonymous in over 2 weeks because I'm just much too busy growing in the business world. I'm not working with any other alcoholics because I'm just much too busy growing in the business world. And I started to get into the stinking thinking, and I started thinking thoughts like, well, maybe now that I have this very impressive job, and I have an education, and I drive a brand new car, and I'm not that little girl from the other side of the tracks, maybe I'm really not an alcoholic. And thank God I did not act on it that night, because one healthy thing I'd done for myself is I did not have anonymity at work. Everybody at work knew I was sober in the program of Alkalix Anonymous, and I had enough respect for this program. I didn't want to embarrass this program by drinking in front of my coworkers, so I put it off the next day. I planned the drink the next day. And I think anybody who has worked these steps as hard as I had worked these steps, God had a chance to intervene, because the next day I was asked to pay a 12-step call on a makeup artist. This makeup artist hadn't shown up at work for 2 weeks. He was held up in a motel. The motel was trying to get him out, so they called my place of employment. My executive director approached me and asked me to go see what I could do. It really messed up my plans. But I did it, and I took another alcoholic with me. We trudged over to the sleazy motel, and I was resentful, and I knocked on this door, and I told him it was Michael, and I'm an alcoholic. And for some reason, he answered the door. If that had been me, I wouldn't have answered the door, but he answered the door. And I stood there speechless. I did not recognize this man. You know, he was a makeup artist, and I knew this beautiful man with all this blonde, wavy hair. This man was bald-headed. He was 10 times his normal size. He was so bloated. He was profusely sweating. He was bleeding from head to toe because he kept falling into objects. He smelled of alcohol, he smelled of urine, and he smelled of vomit. And at that point, as I stood there speechless, I had a spiritual experience. I had an inner voice talk to me, and it was loud, and it was clear, and it said, Michael, this is you. You are not like the people you were with last night. If you drink again, you're standing in front of a mirror. And that man doesn't know it, but he's the one who paid a 12-step call on me. Because that night I got my fanny into a meeting of Alkalix Anonymous, and I recommitted to this program. Since that day, I've gone to more meetings than I've ever gone to. I work with more alcoholics than I've ever worked with, because I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the longer I'm sober, the more I need meetings. The longer I'm sober, the easier it is for me to forget where I came from. This disease is truly cunning, baffling, and powerful. The last story I'm going to share with you is how I came to terms with the God I have in my life today. I told you that my daughter was 15 years old when she got to this program. At the age of 18, she had 3 years of sobriety. She and her girlfriend were leaving an AA dance. They were in the parking lot of the dance. A man came up to them with a gun, forced these two girls in the car at gunpoint, and kidnapped them. He knocked the one girl unconscious and brutally raped my daughter for over 2 hours. And I hate the word rape, because rape sounds like it's just about sex, but rape is really about terror, and it's about violence. And the whole time this was going on, my daughter knew he was going to kill her anyway. And she was so angry at God. It took her over 2 years to remember. She did say a prayer to live. And this man was drinking. He had a bottle of alcohol in his pocket that he drank throughout the whole ordeal, thank God, because he got quite drunk. And at the point where he is forcing my daughter into the trunk of the car, somehow my daughter got some kind of courage to make some kind of an effort to save her own life. And she caught him off guard and slugged him in the face as hard as she could. He tripped and he fell down. The gun slid under the wheel, and she ran down the street naked, and she got away. He got back into the car and took off with the car, but later on down the street, he rolled the other girl out into the street, so both girls lived. But the road of recovery was real hard. And it was real long. My daughter and I felt absolutely betrayed. How could God let this happen to us? We were both sober in the program of Alkalix Anonymous. How could God let this happen to us? We were working these steps as hard as we could, and this is a spiritual program. But the hardest thing for me to deal with was a sentence in the big book. It used to be one of my favorite pages. I used to tell people to read it all the time. It's page 449, and it talks about acceptance. And I still like the part on acceptance, but that one sentence says, absolutely nothing in God's world happens by mistake. Clancy says alcoholism is a disease of perception. I'm still an alcoholic. I still get my disease of perception because I perceive that to mean that if nothing in God's world happens by mistake, then that had to be an act of God. It had to be an act of God. And I wanted to leave Alkalix Anonymous, and I wanted to leave God because I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt I didn't want any part of a God that could operate like that. And thank God for a man named Bill Honeycutt, who's now deceased. He's one of those old-timers who used to take me around. He just took me by the hand, and he said, Michael, God is good, and good is God. And if it's not good, it's not of God. He said, man has free will. That man was acting on his free will, and your daughter was just a victim. He said if man didn't have free will, we wouldn't all be sitting in a meeting of Alkalix Anonymous. We'd all be perfect people. And when he told me that, I had a spiritual release, and I knew he was telling me the truth. And I love to hear my sponsor, Polly, share. She always talks about finding God deep within. And that's what it says in the big book. It says we find God deep within. And on that same page, it says it may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things. And when I'm into fear and I'm into calamity, even today, I feel disconnected from my higher power. And that's when I so desperately need the people in Alkalix Anonymous, because if God is deep within me, then God is deep within you. And it's at these times that God will reach out through another member of this program and pull me back into the sunlight of the Spirit. And that's what happened to me through a man named Bill Honeycutt. So I came to terms with my God again, but I still had so much trouble with that sentence in the big book. I could hear somebody at a table say something, talk about something wonderful to somebody else, and then say that sentence, and I would feel absolute rage. I would just feel rage. And I sponsor a lot of women in this program, and because I have this story I sponsor women who have suffered terrible, terrible tragedies. And one of these women, whose tragedy was worse than my daughter's, made the mistake of telling me that her tragedy must be God's will, because in the big book it says absolutely nothing in God's world happens by mistake. This woman desperately needed comfort, and I went off on her like a crazy woman, and I started screaming at her to the top of my lungs that wasn't written by the first 100 alcoholics. It's not in the first 164 pages of the big book. I slammed that big book down. I said, that's not even in the first 2 editions of this book. And I made this woman cry. And I knew at that point that I was the one who had a problem. I have a resentment about something in the big book. And this resentment is not only hurting me, this resentment is now hurting other people. And I came to a place of really being willing to give it up. And I prayed for God. For a long time, I prayed to God to help me with that sentence. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I was already getting on airplanes and traveling and sharing my story, but I was with my sponsor in a little meeting, and she was the speaker in this meeting, and she was sharing about a tape out by Clancy. And if she was here, she'd tell you to go buy that tape. And the name of that tape is Alcoholism, Disease of Perception. And right in that meeting, when she said the words, disease of perception, I had the biggest spiritual encounter that I have ever had, and I haven't had one since. But that spiritual encounter, I couldn't see anything in the room. Everything was light, and I couldn't hear another word Polly said. I had that inner voice talk to me again, and it's loud, it's clear, it's echoing, and it isn't through the ears. That said, Michael, you know what happens in a meeting of Alkalix Anonymous is part of God's world. What happens when you're working those 12 steps is part of God's world. The progression of all good is part of God's world. What happened in that car 9 years ago was part of man's world. And when I was able to separate man's world from God's world, I was able to come to terms with that sentence in the big book. And I, too, can tell you this morning, absolutely nothing in God's world happens by mistake. It's God's world that got me to the program of Alkalix Anonymous. 2 weeks after I had that spiritual experience through a weird series of coincidences, those God coincidences, I found myself sitting at a little dinner table having dinner with Dr. Paul, who wrote that sentence in the big book. And I was at such peace, I did not have to go off on this man and tell him all about my resentment. Because I knew at that point it did not matter what he meant when he wrote it. What mattered was how I perceived it. And sometimes I have to work on my perception so that perception can work in my life. And that might not work for you, and that's okay, because I truly believe that God works for each one of us at our own level of understanding. I once heard if you take 1 step towards God, God takes 10 steps towards you. And in this lifetime, as we know it, we will never, ever reach God's level of understanding. But once we're on a spiritual path, God does not want to lose one of us. So He comes to each one of us, and He works for each one of us at our individual level of understanding. And that's why what works for you might not work for me, and what works for me might not work for you. But the beauty of Alkalix Anonymous is whatever you believe, it will work within the 12 steps. Since that day that man's heard my talk, we've had lots of spiritual talks. We've talked at lots of conventions together, and today I even consider this man my spiritual advisor. And what he told me about that sentence is he did not mean anything like that when he wrote that sentence. He told me he was not thinking of man's inhumanity to man. He said my spiritual experience was the best explanation he could think of as to why evil exists in this world. And I'm so thankful I paid attention to something I read in the 12 and 12. It said restraint. It's under step 10. It said restraint of pen and tongue. Because when I found out this man was still alive, I used to think everybody in the big book was dead. When I found out this man was still alive, I cannot tell you how many countless times I sat down and I started to write him a hate letter and tell him exactly what I thought about him and exactly what I thought about that sentence. And if I had followed through, I would have missed out on this gift, because today this man is a gift in my life. And he gets lots of letters about that sentence. He gets lots of phone calls about that sentence. And what he does a lot of the time today is he just gives them my phone number. I really want to thank you for allowing me to be here. I know today I've been catapulted into what Bill calls that fourth dimension of existence. And I love talking about the fourth dimension because Bill liked talking about it. And he talks about it on page 25. He says, rocketed into that fourth dimension. But my favorite page is page 8, where he says catapulted, because on that page he gives you a description of what that fourth dimension is like. Today I know happiness, I know peace, but best of all, absolutely best of all today, I know usefulness. Thank you.